The address that held so much importance till she visited the place had lost its value once she realized that it would bring nothing but pain. She was a simpleton. She could not see the manipulation and prudent nature of Mrs. Darling. The Address by Marga Minko is a touching story of psychological interest. It explores the working of young mind in the times of war. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to your Prep School English class. I'm Babita Tamaya, your Prep School English teacher. In today's session, I'll be discussing the second chapter from your snapshot textbook named as The Address by Marga Minko. So before going into the story, let's see what is the agenda for the day. So in today's session, we are going to discuss about the author. We'll know about the author, the theme of the story, and the characters, which are the main characters which comes under the story, and the summary or the synopsis of this story. So let's start without wasting much of our time and dwell deep into today's session. So the first thing is about the narrator, Marga Minko. She is a Dutch journalist and she is also a writer. Minko published her first book that is known as The Bitter Herb, which was the nameless character goes through war experience reminiscent the author. So she had written the book during the time of the war. This is about the author Marga Minko. Now let's see the theme of the story. So let's see what is the theme all about. A touching story of a girl who goes in search of her mother's belonging after World War II, that is in Holland. Where is the situation or the story started? That is in Holland. So here is a girl. The girl is nothing but the narrator. She goes in search of her mother's belonging after the Second World War. Once everything settles down, once they come to the normal situation and the position, here the narrator going in search of her mother's belonging. Even after finding what she wanted to touch, to see, to feel and to remember, she leaves everything behind as it could not bring her back her mother's death. So whatever she wanted to collect her mother's things, the belongings, she saw that, she feels it. But do you think that she brought it back? She never brought the things or the belongings of her mother. She leaves everything there and walks out of the house because she feels that if I get those things, I can't get my mother back. Because her mother is no more, she is dead. So will she come back? No. Then what shall I do with the belongings? It will be just a pain for the narrator. So she leaves all her belongings, that is the mother's belongings, and walk out of the house. The address that held so much importance till she visited the place had lost its value once she realized that it would bring nothing but pain. So whatever she wanted, the address she visited, she got her all her mother's belonging, but she didn't want to take it back. She says that it is just a pain. She just wants to forget the address so that it will be easy for her to forget all those mother's belonging. She doesn't want to be in much pain. This is the theme of the chapter, The Address. Now let's see the main characters in the story. The first is about the daughter. The daughter is nothing but the narrator of the story, Marga Minko. So she is the narrator, returns to Holland. So after the World War II, she's coming back to Holland and go to the address where her mother's precious belongings were kept. So she's coming to the village back. Why did she come to Holland? That is after the Second World War, in search of her mother's belonging. The precious things of her mother's belonging, she comes in search of that. And kept after the situation was normal after the World War II in Holland. So when she is coming back, after everything comes to a normal situation, she is coming back to Holland in search of her mother's belonging. That is the first character, daughter. The next is Mrs. S. Here the name is not given. It is just mentioned as Mrs. S. Mrs. S is the narrator's mother. So here the daughter, that is the narrator, is coming in search of her belongings. She was a simpleton. She could not see the manipulation and prudent nature of Mrs. Darling. Simpleton. Who is simpleton? The narrator's mother is simpleton. Simpleton, it means to say that she believes the person very easily and she'll be cheated by those. So that is known as simpleton. So the same way here, she believes Mrs. Darling too much, and later all her belongings is given to this lady, that is Mrs. Darling. She is one of her acquaintance. She trusted Mrs. Darling and allowed to keep her belongings too for time being. So as I told, that is the narrator's mother believed Mrs. Darling a lot. She was showing so much of concern and care and love to the narrator's mother. That is the thing. What happened with the narrator's mother, she believed her a lot. So during the time of the war, they were supposed to vacate. If they asked them to vacate the house and go, they couldn't carry everything or they couldn't shift everything from there. That was the reason that the narrator's mother gave few of her belongings to Mrs. Darling. That was the character of Mrs. Yes. And the next one is the very cunning personality, that is Mrs. Darling. So Mrs. Darling, she was an old acquaintance of Mrs. Yes. As I told, she was the old acquaintance of Mrs. S, that is the narrator's mother. A cunning personality. Who is the cunning personality? Mrs. Darling. She was very reluctant to recognize the daughter. So here, when the daughter or the narrator came in search of her mother's belonging, what Mrs. Darling is doing? She is refusing to recognize the daughter and does not allow the narrator to enter the house. So what is Mrs. Darling doing? So when the daughter has come in search of her mother's belonging, did Mrs. Darling take her inside the house? She did not do that. Instead of that, she just refused and said that she doesn't even know who is she, and she didn't even allow her to enter inside the house. This is the characters in this story. Now let's see what is the summary all about. So before that, let me give a little bit introduction based on this chapter. The Address by Marga Minko is a touching story of psychological interest. It explores the working of young mind in the times of war. During the World War II, the Germans invaded Holland, where 90% of the people were Jews. That is, their house in Holland, they belonged to Jews. So all the Jews were asked to go out of the Holland. So that is 90% of the people were from Jews. Most of the Jews fled with fear and they just moved to other countries. Thousands of people were imprisoned by concentration camp. A woman and with her little daughter had also to leave their house. At that time, a woman left all her things with the women known to her. After some time, the woman died and the house was destroyed. So once the world was settled, once it comes back to the normal situation, the daughter comes to this house in search of her mother's belonging. She knew the address where she was staying along with her mother. She comes in search of that address to search or to get her mother's belonging. So from there, the story begins. And the main person is Mrs. Darling's indifferent attitude. So how did she behave when the narrator came to the house of Mrs. Darling in search of her mother's belonging? So narrator knocks at the slightly open door of her house. So whose house she has come here? The narrator came to Mrs. Darling's house. She came and she was ringing the bell, and the door, there was a slight open in the door, and where she could see something over there. Here, when the narrator visited Mrs. Darling's house, she's not at all opening the door. There was a slight open. From there, she could peep what's happening inside the house. So she's ringing the bell continuously, and upon asking Mrs. Darling, so what does Mrs. Darling do? So the narrator is questioning. She is asking, do you know Mrs. S? When the narrator asks such question, Mrs. Darling is completely silent. She doesn't even want to give any kind of an answer. And she also refuses to recognize the narrator, that is Mrs. S' daughter. She says she doesn't recognize the narrator. Mrs. Darling is saying, I don't know who are you. She gets to know who is narrator, why she has come. That is the main reason she is just stopping herself in recognizing the narrator. Next, The narrator thought she might have gone to the wrong house. When the lady, that is when Mrs. Darling, was not ready to recognize her, the narrator feels that she has rang the bell of someone else's house. She has come to the wrong address. That is what she feels. Is it so? Did she go to the wrong address? Let's see what's next. Narrator got a glimpse of her mother's green knitted cardigan that Mrs. Darling was wearing. So first, she felt that she has reached the wrong address because Mrs. Darling was not recognizing her. And when she was about to leave, in that small gap, she could see Mrs. Darling wearing her mother's attire. What was Mrs. Darling wearing? She was wearing green knitted cardigan. So this belongs to narrator's mother. So that was her belonging. By looking into that attire, the narrator will come to the conclusion that she has reached the right place. But only the thing, Mrs. Darling is refused to recognize her. Mrs. Darling somehow avoids talking to her, shamelessly shut the door. So when the narrator is there, she's talking. The Mrs. Darling is talking, but where? Making her stand outside. She's not even inviting the narrator inside the house. With that small gap, she's trying to talk the narrator, and at last she shuts the door shamefully on her face. What follows next? Here, Mrs. Darling, without talking to the narrator, without inviting her inside the house, she is shutting the door shamefully on her face. So what follows next? Even after she is closing the door was closed for the narrator, but she stood there for some time. She didn't move away. She stood there for some time. That is near the steps. She waited there for some time. She thought that she might open, she might come and call. She didn't do that. But instead of that, Mrs. Darling said, you can come and visit some other day. You can come home some other day, but not today. So before going, she felt that there might be someone inside the house. There might be some guest. That is the reason she is not talking to me. She felt that and she just moved out of the house. She noticed someone watching her through the window. So there was a small gap, as I told, in the door. So there she could find that someone is watching who? The narrator. Whether she has gone or still there, she could see that someone watching near the door. After Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her, narrator walked back to the station thinking about her mother. So when she did not recognize, when she refused to know who was the narrator, what the narrator thought, she just left the house and she was about to leave for the station. She was going back to the station. Station is nothing but the railway station, thinking about her mother. So when she was just moving, walking on the streets, she just recalled the memories that there was a burnt house. She just recalled all those memories and she could recall the memories of her mother telling the stories also. Narrator recalls her mother's words. Mother had given Darling's address years ago. When she was walking to the streets, she is just recalling the memories or recalling the words of her mother told. When the narrator came home, she finds some of the things missing over there. So at that time, mother says that most of the belongings or the antique pieces are given to Mrs. Darling to keep for some time. Later, we are going to collect it. She remembers all these stories and she remembers the address also. During the first half of the war. So when was it told? The story was told in the first half of the war, first half of the World War. The story was told by mother. She is just recalling those words and she also gets to know even her mother had told the address of Mrs. Darling. Mother had told her that whenever Mrs. Darling came, she took something with her saying that she wanted to preserve everything. So whenever Mrs. Darling comes to the narrator's mother's house, she used to take one or the other belongings. The narrator's house was well decorated. The mother had kept the things very neatly wherever it has to be placed. So looking into that, and there was a war happening, they might ask them to shift the house. Because of that, the Mrs. Darling is taking the advantage. Almost most of the antique pieces or the beautiful things of the narrator's mother was taken by Mrs. Darling. So whenever she comes and goes back, she used to take one or the other beautiful things from the narrator's house. This is what's told by narrator's mother. And what did she say? She said that Mrs. Darling says that Why she is taking it away, all the beautiful things? Because she wants to preserve everything and keep. That was the reason given by Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Yes was obliged with this action of Mrs. Darling because it was risky during the war. So when she said that I'm going to preserve it everything, Mrs. Yes was very much pleased by her words, because as I told it, the war was happening. One or the other day they might ask them to leave the house and go. So the narrator's mother was worried because they couldn't shift each and everything. All shifting all the things was not possible with them. So she gave little of her belongings to Mrs. Darling, where she could preserve and keep it with her. That was the reason giving it to Mrs. Darling. So by this, the narrator will get to know the memories or the words of her mother told about Mrs. Darling. Narrator was walking in familiar places for the first time since the war. So the places she is going to the station, while walking, she could find some familiar places that when she goes there, she will be like, I have seen this place. I have some memories here. She just thinks about the familiar places over there while she was walking to the station. She did not want to upset herself with the single places full of memories. So she was not upset. So as the way she walked, wherever she walked, she could get some memories of that old days. She was not upset. She didn't want to get upset. She just tried to recollect the memories of the past. In the train, she remembers where she had met Mrs. Darling. So while she was about to move, she just recalls, where did I see Mrs. Darling? So she had met Mrs. Darling once, that is at home. That was not for a very long duration, for a short period of time she had seen Mrs. Darling. So this is how she tries to recollect her memories. Her mother had told about Mrs. Darling, and that was the first time narrator met her. So when the mother told about Darling, she used to say that whenever she comes, she takes one or the other thing and she tells me that she wants to preserve everything. All these things was told by the narrator's mother to the narrator. And that is the time she met Mrs. Darling first time at home. Mrs. Darling was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Here itself we'll get to know Mrs. Darling was not filthy rich. She was from a middle class family. So what was she wearing? She was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless. That was whatever the hat she was wearing, it did not have any kind of a shape. That is what her attire was. Narrator had asked her mom if Mrs. Darling lived far away. Then her mom had told Mrs. Darling lived at number 46 Marconi Street. So here she gets to know where Mrs. Darling lives, because this is the address told by her mother, that is the narrator's mother. So when she recalls, when she collects the memories, she will get to know that Mrs. Darling lives in the number 46 at Marconi Street. This is the address of Mrs. Darling. And later she'll get to know that she has not come to a wrong place. It was the right place where she has reached in search of the address of her mother's belonging. Narrator reluctant to see the belongings. So what happens after that? After the war was over, the narrator was not interested to go and to see their belongings lying with Mrs. Darling. So she thought of leaving the station, that leaving the Holland and go back to her home. So before going, she'll give a second thought. So after everything was settled, when she was about to leave, she feels that, or she thinks that, I don't want to see any of her mother's belonging. I'll just leave everything. But she couldn't do that. She gave a second thought. She was scared that she might become nostalgic if she saw these things in boxes and the cupboards. So she feels that if she sees all these things, all her mother's belongings, she might be very upset, because those are the things of her mother who collected, who kept everything in a proper place, and it was decorated so very well. Gradually, after life came back to normal, she grows curious to know about the possessions. So That was when she was small, it happened, but when she grew up, it was very conscious. She wanted to know about her mother's belonging. That is the reason she comes back after the World War II when everything comes to a normal situation. Narrator's visit again. So as I told, she was about to leave the station, but she gives a second thought and she says that, or she feels that going and visiting the Mr. Darling's house again for the second time. So when she goes for the second time, who is the one who is opening the door? The narrator. After the failed first visit, she was failed in her first visit, decided to visit again. That is the second visit the narrator is doing to Mrs. Darling's house. So this time it is a girl of 15 opened the door. So first time it was the Mrs. Darling. She didn't even open the door in that small gap she was talking to the narrator. But this time when she went there, it was a girl who was around 15 years opened the door since her mother was not there. So Mrs. Darling was not there at home. At that time, the narrator went there and Mrs. Darling's daughter is opening the door for the narrator. She followed the girl along the passage, noticing the old-fashioned iron candle holder which was never used. So here the girl, that is Mrs. Darling's daughter, opens the door and calls the narrator inside. So here that is the girl is walking inside the passage. So here the narrator also follows the girl. When she was following the girl, there she could see the fashion iron candle that was not at all used. So this fashion iron candle belongs to the narrator's mother. As she entered the living room, just following the girl, as Mrs. Darling was not inside the house, she is following the girl. The way she was going, there she could find her mother's belonging. So first she finds the fashion iron candle and it was not at all used. Next she goes to the living room. She enters the living room. What she sees inside the living room? She found herself in their old belongings as they were kept in a haphazard manner with the ugly furniture and muggy smell. So here, her mother had kept all that belongings, that is the things in a particular place. It was kept so very beautifully. But here in the Mrs. Darling's house, everything was dumped in one room. It was not at all set as if it was thrown on the floor. It was kept such bad condition. And there was a muggy smell. What do you mean by muggy smell? If you don't open the door for a month or the year, what happens when you suddenly open the door? You can get a kind of a smell. That kind of a smell she used to get when she was entering inside the living room. When she saw that living room, she felt really bad because all her mother's belongings was dumped in one corner, not at all set, and it was not in a particular place also. The tablecloth, silver cutlery, etc. belonged to her family. So as she moves towards the living room, she could see the tablecloth which her mother used and silver cutlery. All the things were belonging to the narrator's mother. By looking into all these things, she feels very sad because it was not in a very good condition or not sent in a good condition. Next, narrator observes. What she observes? Mrs. Darling's daughter was placing teacups for the tea to be served. So the mother, that is Mrs. Darling, had told the daughter to keep the tea ready. She is preparing the tea. As she is preparing the tea, she prepares one more cup because the narrator have come home. So what she observes there? She was pouring tea from white teapot. So she was pouring the tea from the white teapot, and this white teapot had golden border on the lid. You can see a teapot with the lid, and the lid had golden color border. So she gets to know even this also belongs to the narrator's mother, that is Mrs. Yes. She also took some spoons from the box. So she is also taking some spoons. So whatever the spoons, she takes it out. Everything belongs to her mother. All this crockery belonged to the narrator's family, which the girl wasn't aware. So whatever she is taking out of the box, might be the spoon or the teapot, whatever she is taking, everything belongs to the narrator's mother, that is Mrs. Yes. But the girl, the daughter of Mrs. Darling, doesn't even know that it doesn't belong to them. The narrator indirectly hinted. So when the narrator gets to know all these things are my mother's belonging, and now she's giving an hint to the Mrs. Darling's daughter. The narrator indirectly hinted to the girl that these things actually belong to someone. So why she says that? She has seen that silver cutlery. So before giving all her mother's belonging, they used to have their food or the dinner in that silver cutlery. How the narrator got to know that is a silver cutlery means one day the narrator's mother had asked her to get it polished. During that time, she got to know whatever the utensils, that is the plates or the silver cutlery they are using, everything is out of silver. But here, Mrs. Darling doesn't know what it is of, whether it's a silver or a normal, she doesn't even know, and she doesn't even know whether it belongs to them or not. But the narrator gives an indirect hint saying that whatever the things you have, I don't think so it belongs to you. Instead of that, it is someone else's belongings were missing from their original places. She says that all the things, whatever you have, almost most of the things belongs to someone else. Why she says that? Because it is not in their original place. Wherever it has to be placed, it is not in their original place. That is the hint given by the narrator to Mrs. Darling's daughter. Narrator also remembered her mother asking her to get the silvery cutlery polished. As I told, when she had come home and the mother, that is the narrator mother's, asked her to get the silver cutlery polished. At that time, she will get to know the utensils, vessels, or the plates used to have a food were of silver plates. Until then, she never had any kind of a knowledge based on that. So, narrator resolution. Narrator decided that she should not stay there anymore. So she came the second visit to meet Mrs. Darling. That was the reason coming there. But she was not there. That is, a 15-year girl opens the door. She goes, she sees all her mother belongings which was kept so very bad. It was not in her original places. Looking all those things, she was very upset. And she decided that she will not stay in Mrs. Darling's house, or she doesn't even want to meet Mrs. Darling. Though the address was correct, the narrator did not want to remember it anymore. At last, she feels that she gets to know, I came and reached the correct address, but she doesn't even want to remember that address anymore. She just wants to forget everything. She felt that these objects were linked to a memory of a time that no longer existed. So before, she felt that all these belongings were linked to her memories, that is her mother's memories, but no longer existed. Does her mother exist? Mother is not there. My mother is dead and she'll be not coming back from her deathbed. When she knows all these things, she just wants to leave everything and go away from Mrs. Darling's house. They had lost their value now. What had lost the value? The belongings. Her mother's belonging lost the value because it was in such a bad condition or the position. Narrator comforts herself by thinking that her present house was too small to accommodate all this stuff. So she feels that she herself comes to the conclusion she stays in a rented house and the rooms are not quite so big where she can accommodate all her mother's belonging. Thinking that she don't have so much of place in her rented house, so she just leaves all her mother's belongings there itself. She leaves her family's belongings back and leaves Mrs. Darling's house. So she came to meet her, but she leaves all her mother's belonging, and before Mrs. Darling comes, she has already left the place. She didn't even want to stay back or meet Mrs. Darling. That's about the chapter, the address. So here, the daughter who was in search of her mother's belonging goes to the correct address and finds her mother's belonging. But in what condition was it? It was in a haphazard condition. It was just thrown away on the floor. By looking into all those things, was she ready to get the things back? She was not at all ready. She felt that my mother itself is not there with me. When she can't come back, why do I take all these belongings? She just wants to forget everything, and she feels that she comes to a conclusion for herself saying that my rented house is too very small. I cannot keep everything there, or I cannot arrange it in my small house. This is what she thinks and leaves all her mother's belongings in Mrs. Darling's house, and without even meeting Mrs. Darling, she comes out of the house. That is about the story, The Address. We'll be back with another session. Until then, have a good day. Keep learning. Thank you.